There's a distinct smell to desperation. It smells like cheap beeswax trying to mask damp rot and roasting mutton you can't quite afford. When Hazel pinned the coarse, lye-washed collar of a maid's dress around her neck, she didn't do it for romance or adventure. She did it because her father was facing debtor's prison, and the man arriving for dinner was their absolute last lifeline. She just didn't know the brooding, mud-spattered investor walking through their door was the Duke of Westmoreland, and he didn't know she was the lady of the house. The uniform belonged to a woman named Betsy, who had possessed the good sense to quit when Hazel's father missed her wages for the third consecutive month. Betsy had been broader in the shoulders and shorter in the leg, which meant the stiff black wool dress presently hung off Hazel's frame like a sack, while the hem stopped awkwardly above her ankles. It smelled fiercely of lye soap and old sweat. Hazel stood in the center of the kitchen, tugging at the starched white collar that bit into the sensitive skin of her neck. Every time she swallowed, the fabric scraped. "Is the roast in?" Her father, Richard, burst through the swinging door. He was a man who had been handsomely wealthy a decade ago, and his face still carried the soft, expectant lines of someone used to being deferred to. Tonight, however, those lines were pulled taut with panic. He wore his best evening coat. It was 5 years out of fashion, the velvet lapels rubbed shiny at the edges. "It's in, Father," Hazel said. She didn't look at him. She was too busy trying to force her feet into Betsy's discarded leather shoes. They were stiff as wood and a half size too small. "He's due any moment." Richard paced the cracked flagstones of the scullery, wringing his hands. "Mr. Croft, Gideon Croft. They say he made his fortune in the northern mills. Rough sort of man, no title, no breeding, but he has capital. Endless capital, Hazel. If I can just secure his investment for the shipping venture, then the butcher will stop threatening to break our windows, and the coal man will deliver again." Hazel finished for him, her voice flat. She jammed her left heel into the shoe. A sharp pinch of pain shot up her ankle. She bit the inside of her cheek. "I know." "You don't have to do this," Richard said, stopping his pacing. For a brief, agonizing second, he looked entirely broken. The bravado melted away, leaving a tired, frightened old man. "It's a degradation. My daughter, serving at the table like a common scullery maid. If we tell Mr. Croft we can't afford a single servant, he'll know you're bankrupt before the soup is even served," Hazel said practically. She grabbed a damp cloth and wiped a smear of flour from the dark wool of her skirt. "Investors don't give money to desperate men. They give money to men who don't need it. Go into the parlor. Pour yourself a glass of the sherry. The good one, not the watered-down one. I'll open the door when he knocks." Richard nodded, his throat working. He turned and retreated, leaving the heavy scent of bay rum and nervous sweat in his wake. Hazel was alone again. The kitchen was suffocatingly hot from the roasting fire, yet a draft from the ill-fitting window rattled the pots hanging on the wall. She hated this house. She hated the peeling wallpaper in the hallways, the squeaking floorboards, the constant low-level anxiety that lived in her chest. Most of all, she hated the romanticized nonsense that suffering built character. Suffering just made you tired. The heavy thud of the brass knocker echoed from the front hall. Hazel jumped, her heart giving a stupid, panicked stutter. She wiped her hands on her apron, took a deep breath of air that smelled of hot mutton fat, and walked out of the kitchen. The corridor was dim. They had only lit half the lamps to save oil. Hazel opened the heavy oak door, preparing to curtsy to some corpulent, self-important industrialist reeking of cigar smoke and new money. Instead, a wall of cold, rain-dampened air hit her in the face. The man standing on the threshold was not corpulent. He was tall, imposingly so, and built with the dense, heavy solidity of a bricklayer. He wore a dark, heavy riding coat, slick with rain, the broad shoulders pulling at the seams. No carriage waited behind him in the street, only a massive, wet-flanked gelding tied to the iron post. "Mr. Gideon Croft?" Hazel asked. She kept her eyes lowered to his chest, aiming for the subservient gaze she had seen Betsy use. "Yes." His voice was a low, resonant rumble. It sounded like gravel shifting underfoot. Please, come in, sir. The master is expecting you. Hazel stepped back. As the man crossed the threshold, the light from the hall sconce caught his face. Hazel forgot to keep her eyes down. He did not look like a wealthy mill owner. He looked like a man who had fought his way out of a gutter and was still deciding if he wanted to go back and finish the job. His jaw was covered in dark, coarse stubble, and a pale, jagged scar cut through the line of his left eyebrow. His eyes were the color of storm-churned slate, hard, flat, and taking in every detail of the decaying hallway with predatory swiftness. He stopped to shrug off his wet overcoat. Hazel stepped forward automatically to take it. The coat weighed as much as a small dog. The damp wool smelled of horses, rain, and cold iron. When she took it from his hands, his knuckles brushed hers. His skin was rough, calloused, and surprisingly warm against her freezing fingers. He didn't hand the coat over blindly. He paused, his slate eyes snapping down to her hands, then up to her face. Hazel froze. She suddenly remembered her hair, hastily pinned up beneath a cheap white mob cap, strands already falling loose around her neck. She remembered the smudged flour on her cheek. Gideon Croft looked at her. He didn't look through her, the way wealthy men looked at servants. He looked at her. His gaze dropped to the collar chafing her neck, then to the tense line of her jaw. "Miserable night for a ride?" he said. It wasn't polite small talk. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a strange, flat intensity. "Indeed, sir," Hazel murmured, dropping her gaze quickly. "If you'll follow me to the parlor." She turned, carrying the heavy, sodden coat, her ill-fitting shoes clacking awkwardly against the floorboards. She could feel his eyes on her back, heavy and assessing, as she led him toward the thin sliver of light spilling from the parlor door. Dinner was a suffocating affair. The dining room, usually drafty and large, felt impossibly small with Gideon Croft sitting at the table. He took up too much space. It wasn't just his physical size, it was the stillness of him. He sat with a quiet, grounded energy, eating the overcooked mutton with mechanical efficiency. He didn't complain about the food, but he didn't praise it either. Richard, meanwhile, was drowning. And so, as you can see, the trade routes to the West Indies are merely waiting for a man with the right vision, Richard said, his voice a little too loud, his laugh a little too forced. He took a gulp of his wine. The glass trembled slightly in his hand. "My ships are sound. The crews are seasoned. It's a guaranteed return, Mr. Croft." Gideon slowly set down his fork. The metallic clink was loud in the quiet room. "I've seen your ledgers, Mr. Linley. You have 2 ships left. One has been impounded in Bristol for unpaid docking fees." Richard's face drained of color. That is a temporary misunderstanding, a clerical error." "A clerical error," Gideon repeated. His tone was devoid of mockery, which somehow made it worse. It was just a brutal, sterile observation. Standing by the sideboard, Hazel gripped the handle of the water pitcher so tightly her knuckles turned white. She hated her father for lying so poorly. She hated this rough, unblinking man for dissecting those lies so effortlessly. But mostly, she hated the sharp, stabbing pain radiating from her left heel. The blister had ruptured somewhere between clearing the soup plates and serving the roast. Every time she shifted her weight, raw skin ground against stiff leather. Her calves ached, and a dull, throbbing headache had settled behind her eyes from the heat of the kitchen and the sheer exhaustion of holding her face in a mask of blank subservience. "More wine, sir?" Hazel stepped out from the shadows, eager to break the agonizing silence that had fallen over the table. Gideon didn't look at her, merely tapping 2 fingers against the base of his empty glass. Hazel moved to his side. The wine bottle was cheap glass, slippery with condensation from the damp cellar. She kept her eyes on the rim of the goblet, trying to ignore the proximity of the man. Up close, he smelled of clean sweat and the faint, sharp tang of saddle soap. She tipped the bottle. At that exact moment, she shifted her weight. The raw flesh of her heel scraped agonizingly against the back of the shoe. Her leg buckled. just a fraction of an inch, just a millimeter of weakness. Her hand jerked. The dark red wine missed the glass. A heavy splash of it hit the white linen tablecloth, and a single bright crimson drop splattered directly onto the cuff of Gideon Croft's crisp white shirt. Hazel froze. The silence in the room suddenly felt like a physical weight. "Good God, girl!" Richard hissed halfway out of his chair, his face flushed with mortification. "Are you blind?" Hazel didn't gasp. She didn't press her hand to her mouth in a delicate show of horror. She was too tired, too in pain, and too angry at the entire pathetic situation. "Bloody hell," she muttered under her breath. It wasn't meant to be heard, but the room was too quiet. She grabbed the linen napkin draped over her forearm and reached down to dab at the spilled wine on the tablecloth. Her hand shook, but not from fear, from the sheer, furious humiliation of it all. Gideon caught her wrist. His grip wasn't punishing, but it was absolute. It felt like an iron band snapping shut over her skin. Hazel inhaled sharply, finally looking up. His slate-gray eyes were inches from hers. He wasn't looking at the spilled wine. He was looking at her hand. Hazel's breath hitched. She suddenly realized what he was seeing. Betsy, the real maid, had hands like sandpaper, red, swollen at the joints from lye and scrubbing brushes. Hazel's hands were calloused from the past few months of hard work, yes, but the nails were neatly filed. The fingers were long and unblemished. They were the hands of a woman who played the piano forte, not one who scrubbed grates. "Leave it," Gideon said softly. "I can clean the cuff, sir," Hazel said. Her voice sounded brittle, foreign to her own ears. She tried to pull her wrist back, but he didn't let go immediately. His thumb moved just a fraction, brushing against the frantic pulse jumping at her wrist. "I said leave it." His voice dropped a register, losing the flat, businesslike edge. It was a command, but there was a strange, probing curiosity beneath it. He released her. Hazel stumbled back a step, almost losing her footing as pain spiked through her heel again. She clutched the wine bottle to her chest, her face burning hot. "I apologize, Mr. Croft," Richard stammered, entirely missing the silent exchange. "She's new, clumsy. I will have her dismissed tomorrow." "Don't bother on my account," Gideon said, his eyes never leaving Hazel's face. "The stain will wash out. Or go to the kitchen." Richard snapped at Hazel, waving his hand frantically. "Get out of sight." Hazel didn't need to be told twice. She turned and fled, her bad foot dragging slightly, the coarse wool of her dress rustling loudly in the quiet room. She pushed through the heavy swinging door into the scullery and let it close behind her. Alone in the dark, hot kitchen, she set the wine bottle on the counter with a loud clatter. She braced her hands on the edge of the wood, dropping her head forward, trying to slow her breathing. "Bloody hell," she thought, closing her eyes against the sting of frustrated tears. "He knows. He looked at my hands, and he knows." By midnight, the house was dead quiet. Richard had retreated to his study with the last of the brandy, alternating between weeping quietly over his ledgers and snoring. Gideon Croft had been shown to the guest bedroom on the second floor, the only room with a hearth that didn't smoke. Hazel sat on the stone steps outside the kitchen door, wrapped in a moth-eaten woolen shawl she had found in the pantry. The rain had stopped, leaving the London air sharp, cold, and smelling heavily of wet soot and wet cobblestones. She had finally taken the shoes off. Her left heel was a bloody, raw mess. She had a bowl of cold water beside her, and she was pressing a torn strip of linen against the blister, hissing through her teeth as the icy water stung the open flesh. She had a cup of the leftover cheap wine resting on the step next to her knee. She wasn't supposed to drink it, but she felt she had earned it. The heavy oak door creaked open behind her. Hazel froze, the bloody rag pressed to her heel. She expected her father, coming to berate her for the wine spill. "Usually servants sleep when the masters are abed," a rough, gravelly voice said. Hazel didn't turn around. Her shoulders slumped. It was him. She heard the heavy thud of his boots on the stone. He stepped out into the damp chill, leaving the door ajar. He wasn't wearing his coat or his cravat. The collar of his white shirt was open, revealing the thick, corded muscles of his neck. In the pale moonlight, he looked less like an investor and more like a brawler resting between rounds. He struck a match against the stone wall. The flare of sulfur briefly illuminated his harsh features as he lit a thin, dark cheroot. The smell of cheap, strong tobacco immediately filled the cold air, overriding the scent of the damp alley. "I couldn't sleep," Hazel said. She kept her voice deliberately coarse, trying to maintain the charade. "Begging your pardon, sir. I'll go inside." She moved to stand up, grabbing her stiff leather shoes. As she put weight on her left foot, a sharp spike of agony shot up her leg. She gasped, stumbling sideways. Gideon moved with shocking speed for a man his size. His hand shot out, catching her by the elbow before she could hit the wet stones. His grip was firm, anchoring her. "Sit down," he ordered, pulling the cheroot from his mouth. "I'm fine," Hazel snapped, the pain making her drop the subservient act entirely. She tried to yank her arm away. "Let me go." Gideon didn't let go. He simply pushed her backward, forcing her to sit heavily back onto the stone step. He looked down at her bare feet, his gaze locking onto the bloodied heel. He let out a low, rough breath. "Are those your shoes?" "They belong to the house," Hazel muttered, pulling her skirt down to cover her ankles. "They don't fit you." "Very little in this house fits right now." Hazel grabbed her cup of wine and took a defiant swallow. She looked up at him, her chin jutting out. She was exhausted, in pain, and tired of pretending. If he was going to tell her father she was insolent, let him. "Did you conclude your business with the master, Mr. Croft? Is he going to keep his ships?" Gideon took a slow drag of his cheroot. The cherry glowed red in the dark, casting harsh shadows over his scarred eyebrow. He exhaled a thin stream of smoke into the damp air. "Your master," Gideon said, the word dragging off his tongue with a heavy dose of irony, "is a fool. He's throwing good money into rotten timber. The West Indies routes are choked with privateers and larger conglomerates. He'll lose whatever I give him." Hazel swallowed hard. The wine suddenly tasted like ash. "So you aren't going to invest?" "I didn't say that." Gideon sat down. He didn't ask for permission. He just folded his large frame onto the narrow stone step next to her. He was too close. The heat radiating from his body cut through the damp chill of the night. Hazel shifted uncomfortably, pulling her shawl tighter. "Why would you give money to a fool if you know it's a loss?" "Because sometimes I am curious," Gideon said. He turned his head, looking at her. Really looking at her. His eyes dropped to the cup of wine in her hand. "Does he know his maid drinks his wine and speaks like a boarding school graduate when she's angry?" Hazel's heart slammed against her ribs. She gripped the cup tighter. "I don't know what you mean." Your accent slipped," Gideon said softly. "When you spilled the wine, you swore. It wasn't the curse of a woman raised in the scullery." He leaned in just a fraction. "And your hands. You hide them in your apron, but I saw them." "I use a pumice stone," Hazel lied, her voice tight. "A pumice stone doesn't change bone structure." Gideon reached out. Before she could pull away, his fingers wrapped around her wrist again. He didn't pull her toward him. He just turned her hand over, exposing the palm to the dim moonlight. His thumb brushed lightly over the pads of her fingers. No calluses from the washboard, no burn marks from the lie. He looked up, his slate eyes pinning her in place. "Who are you?" Hazel stared at him. She could smell the tobacco on his breath, the clean sweat of his skin. She felt a sudden dangerous urge to tell him the truth, to admit that she was Hazel Linley, that she was tired of starving, tired of lying, tired of carrying her father's failures on her back. But she looked at the hard, uncompromising line of his jaw. This man was ruthless. He had dismantled her father's business plans over overcooked mutton without blinking. If he knew how pathetic their charade was, He would walk out tomorrow and leave them to the wolves. She yanked her hand out of his grip. "I'm the maid," Hazel said, her voice trembling with forced anger. "And you are a guest, and neither of us should be sitting on the back steps." She grabbed her shoes in one hand, abandoning the cup of wine, and pushed herself to her feet. She didn't bother trying to put the shoes on. She just turned and limped up the steps toward the kitchen door. "That dress," Gideon said. His voice caught her just as her hand touched the latch. She paused, looking back over her shoulder. He was still sitting on the steps, the cheroot hanging from his lips, watching her. In the darkness, he looked like a predator resting in the shadows. "It chafes your neck," he observed, his voice a low rumble. "You've been scratching at it all night. A woman who wears that uniform every day doesn't notice the wool anymore." Hazel swallowed, her throat incredibly tight. She didn't have an answer for that. She pushed the door open and fled into the dark, silent house, leaving the brooding investor alone in the cold. She didn't know that Gideon Croft sat on the steps long after she left, staring at the empty doorway. And she certainly didn't know that the Duke of Westmoreland had just decided exactly what his terms for the investment would be. The morning tasted of old ash. Hazel woke before dawn, her body stiff. The narrow cot in the servants' quarters was lumpy, smelling faintly of mothballs and damp plaster. She lay there for 3 long breaths, watching the gray light bleed through the cracked window pane. Then she threw off the thin woolen blanket. There was no time to be tired. The left heel of her foot was a tight, angry knot of pain. She bound it tightly in a fresh strip of linen before forcing it back into the stiff leather shoe. It took a supreme effort of will not to cry out. Downstairs, the kitchen was freezing. The fire had died completely in the night. Hazel dragged a bucket of coal from the scullery, the metal handle biting into her bare hands. She knelt on the cold flagstones, plunging her hands into the black lead polish to blacken the iron grate. It was filthy, mindless work. The harsh chemical smell of the polish stung her eyes. "You are applying it entirely too thick." Hazel jumped, dropping the stiff bristled brush. It hit the hearth with a sharp clatter. Gideon Croft stood in the doorway. He was fully dressed, though he wore no cravat, his white shirt open at the throat again. He held a steaming cup of coffee she certainly hadn't brewed. The sharp, bitter scent of the roasted beans cut through the smell of the black lead. "I prefer an early start," he said, stepping into the room. He walked over to the stove, grabbed the iron kettle, and poured himself more water without asking. "Found the beans in the pantry. You're welcome to a cup. You look like you need it." Hazel scrambled to her feet, wiping her blackened hands on her coarse apron. "That's not my place, sir." "Stop it!" The command was quiet, but it cracked through the cold kitchen like a whip. Gideon turned around, leaning his hips against the wooden counter. He watched her over the rim of his cup. "Stop playing the dim-witted scullion," he said. "It insults us both. I told you last night. I know you aren't what you pretend to be. Now, why are you on your knees ruining your hands on a grate?" Hazel's jaw tightened. She hated the way he looked at her. He didn't look with pity. He looked with the cold, calculating dissection of a man assessing a damaged ship. "Someone has to clean the grate, Mr. Croft. The house doesn't run on magic." "Where is the actual staff?" "Gone." Hazel lifted her chin. If he wanted the truth, he would get the ugly, unvarnished reality. "My master hasn't paid them in 3 months. Betsy, the maid whose dress I'm presently wearing, left a fortnight ago. The cook left yesterday morning." Gideon didn't look surprised. He took a slow sip of his coffee. "So the roast last night—" "Me," Hazel said flatly. "And I overcooked it because I was trying to polish the silver at the same time." He set his cup down. The sound was a dull thud against the wood. "And your master? Does he know his daughter is ruining her knees in the soot?" Hazel froze. The blood roared in her ears. "He knows. He hadn't just suspected she wasn't a maid. He knew exactly who she was." Hazel's throat clicked dry. She stepped back, her sore heel throbbing. I don't... I looked at the portrait in the upstairs hallway, Gideon interrupted, his voice void of any triumph. It was just a heavy, tired statement. It was painted several years ago. You had better clothes, and you were smiling, but the bone structure is identical. You are Hazel Linley. Hazel stared at him. The silence stretched, filled only by the rattle of the drafty window. She felt stripped naked. All the humiliating effort, the chafing wool, the burned fingers, the agonizing blisters. It had all been for absolutely nothing. Are you going to leave, then? She asked. Her voice cracked. She hated herself for it. No. Gideon picked up his coffee again. I am going to invest. Hazel blinked. What? Your father's business is a sinking ship, but the roots themselves hold value. I want the roots. Gideon pushed off the counter, walking slowly toward her. He stopped when he was close enough that she could smell the sandalwood soap on his skin. I told your father my terms half an hour ago in his study. He's awake? He was. He's currently digesting the contract. Gideon looked down at her. His eyes lingered on the black soot smudged across her cheek, then dropped to her trembling, blackened hands. I offered him enough capital to clear his debts and repair the 2 remaining ships. In exchange, I take a 90% stake in the profits, and I assume total operational control. He is a figurehead, nothing more. 90%, Hazel breathed. That's robbery. That is salvation, Gideon corrected roughly. He would be in debtor's prison by Tuesday. I just bought his freedom. But I have one more condition. Hazel looked up. His slate-gray eyes were entirely unreadable. I have a vast amount of paperwork to audit if I am to salvage this mess, Gideon said. I require a clerk, someone who understands the ledgers, the manifests, and the routing charts. Hire a clerk, she said defensively. I don't trust outside clerks with my ledgers, he replied. And I happen to know there is a woman in this house who is intimately familiar with her father's failing business. A woman who reads well enough to curse like a gentleman. He reached out. Hazel flinched, expecting him to grab her arm. Instead, he took the filthy scrubbing brush from her blackened fingers. He tossed it onto the hearth. Wash your hands, Miss Linley, Gideon said quietly. You work for me now, and I don't want soot on my paperwork. The study smelled of dust, old leather bindings, and the sharp metallic tang of iron gall ink. Hazel sat at the small side desk, her back rigid. She was still wearing the maid's dress. Gideon had demanded her help, but he hadn't demanded she change, and a stubborn, cynical part of her refused to put on a silk day dress. If he wanted to humiliate her family by treating them like employees, she would wear the uniform of one. Gideon sat at her father's massive mahogany desk. He took up the entire space. He worked in complete silence, his heavy, scarred hands moving over the ledgers with surprising speed. He didn't use a ruler to track the lines. He just absorbed the numbers. His brow furrowed, the jagged scar over his eye catching the afternoon light. The manifest for the Windsor Pearl, Gideon said, breaking an hour of silence. He didn't look up. Where is it? Hazel sorted through the chaotic pile of papers her father had left behind. Her fingers, scrubbed raw with lye soap to remove the black lead, stung as they brushed against the dry vellum. Here. She stood, carrying the heavy sheaf of papers across the room. She set it on his desk. He reached for it at the same time she let go. His knuckles brushed the back of her hand. The brief contact felt like a static shock. Hazel pulled her hand back quickly, clasping it behind her back. Gideon didn't react. He pulled the manifest closer, dipping his pen into the brass inkwell. The heavy scratching of the nib against the paper filled the room. Your father logged 300 crates of West Indian sugar on this voyage, Gideon muttered, tracing the line with the feathered end of his pen. But the Port Authority taxes only reflect 250. He was either smuggling or he's incompetent. He's not a smuggler, Hazel said hotly. Then he is a fool who paid for 50 ghost crates, Gideon replied calmly. He dipped his pen again. I will dock the difference from his monthly stipend. You can't do that. Hazel stepped forward, slamming her hands down on the edge of his desk. She leaned over, glaring at him. The sugar was ruined in transit. Water damage in the lower hold off the coast of Madeira. He didn't pay tax on it because it was dumped overboard. It's logged in the captain's secondary report. Gideon stopped writing. He slowly lifted his head. He looked at her hands, braced on his desk, and then up to her face. They were inches apart. Hazel could see the tiny flecks of silver in his dark gray eyes. She could see the slight, almost imperceptible tension in his jaw. Is it? He asked softly. Yes. Hazel swallowed, her anger faltering slightly under the weight of his stare. It's in the blue ledger. I tracked it myself. Gideon leaned back in his leather chair. It groaned under his weight. He crossed his arms over his broad chest. You tracked it. The daughter of a gentleman, spending her evenings balancing trade ledgers. Hazel straightened up, feeling her face flush. My father is not good with numbers. Someone had to do it. And yet he is bankrupt. I can't control the weather, Mr. Croft, nor the pirates off the Barbary coast. Hazel snapped. Her voice was bitter. I only managed the math. I told him not to send the Pearl out until the hull was repitched. He didn't listen to me. I am just a woman. What do I know of ships? Apparently, more than the man who owns them. Gideon stood up. The sudden movement made Hazel step back. He was so incredibly tall. He walked around the edge of the desk, moving with that quiet, heavy grace that unsettled her so much. Show me, he said. Show you what? The blue ledger. Show me your math. He stood beside her small desk. He was too close. Hazel squeezed past him, her rough wool skirt brushing against his trousers. She sat down quickly, pulling the battered blue ledger from the bottom drawer. She opened it to the middle pages. Her handwriting filled the columns, neat, precise, desperate little rows of numbers trying to hold off ruin. Gideon leaned over her shoulder. He didn't touch her, but he didn't have to. The heat of his body enveloped her. She could feel his breath, slow and steady, stirring the stray hairs that had escaped her mob cap. Her heart began to beat a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. He braced one large hand on the desk, right next to hers. She stared at his hand. There was a thin white scar slicing across his thumb. These were not the hands of an investor who sat in comfortable rooms. These were hands that had pulled ropes and broken jaws. Your margins are tight, Gideon murmured. His voice was a low rumble right next to her ear. They had to be. You accounted for the tariff hikes in Bristol before they were even legally passed. A rumor on the docks, Hazel said, her voice breathy. She hated how weak she sounded. She cleared her throat. The butcher's boy heard it from a sailor. Gideon turned his head. His face was mere inches from hers. You have a sharp mind, Hazel. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded different in his mouth. Rougher. He didn't say it with the polite, distant respect of a gentleman. He said it like a physical claim. Hazel looked up into his eyes. She forgot to breathe. The air in the study felt incredibly thin, heavy with the scent of ink and the raw electric tension humming between them. She wanted to lean back, away from him. She wanted to lean in. It was a terrifying contradiction. A loud, aggressive pounding echoed from the front of the house, followed by a muffled shout. The spell shattered. Hazel jumped up from the chair so fast it tipped backward, hitting the floor with a loud crack. She gasped, her hands flying to her chest. Gideon didn't flinch. He slowly straightened up, his eyes never leaving her face. The pounding came again, louder this time. That is the tradesman's door, Hazel whispered, panic instantly replacing the strange, suffocating heat in her chest. It's the butcher. The rain had returned. a cold, miserable drizzle that turned the back alley into a slick trench of mud and horse dung. Hazel hurried down the hallway, her bad heels shooting spikes of pain up her leg with every step. She pulled open the heavy wooden door to the alley. Mr. Miller stood on the step. He was a large, ruddy-faced man who smelled of raw meat and stale ale. He had a heavy cleaver shoved into the leather belt at his waist, a theatrical touch he used when collecting debts from desperate people. "Where is he?" Miller demanded, not bothering with a greeting. He tried to push past her. "Mr. Linley is not receiving callers," Hazel said, blocking the doorway with her body. She kept her chin up, but her stomach roiled. Miller stopped, looking her up and down. He took in the cheap maid's dress, the coarse apron, the mob cap. He sneered, a wet, ugly sound. "I ain't here for a social call, girl," Miller barked. "He owes me £4, 6 shillings. I ain't delivered a scrap of beef to this house in a month, and I want my coin. Tell that pathetic old drunk to come out here." "I will pass along your message," Hazel said smoothly, trying to shut the door. Miller slammed his heavy, meaty hand against the wood, stopping it. "You'll do more than that, you little tart." He reached out and grabbed her by the arm. His grip was bruising, his thick fingers digging into her bicep. He yanked her forward, half pulling her out into the rain. Hazel gasped, stumbling over the threshold. Her bad foot hit the slick cobblestones, and her ankle gave way. She fell hard against the door frame, scraping her forearm against the rough brick. "Let go of me," she cried, panic finally breaking through her cynical veneer. She struggled, but Miller was too heavy, his grip too tight. "You tell him I'm taking the silver if he don't have the coin," Miller spat, shaking her arm. "I know you're hiding it in there. Think you're so high and mighty—" A shadow fell over them. It was absolute. The cold drizzle seemed to stop hitting Hazel's face. Miller suddenly stopped speaking. He let go of Hazel's arm so fast she stumbled backward. Gideon Croft stood in the doorway. He didn't look angry. That was the most terrifying part. There was no flush of rage on his face, no shouting. He stood completely still, his broad shoulders filling the frame. His slate eyes were fixed on the butcher with the cold, dead detachment of an executioner calculating a swing. "Take your hand off her," Gideon said. His voice barely rose above the sound of the rain, but it carried a weight that made the hairs on Hazel's arms stand up. Miller swallowed hard, taking a step back. But he was a proud man, used to bullying broken gentlemen. "This ain't your business. Linley owes me." "He owes you nothing. The debt was settled this morning." Gideon reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy leather coin purse. He didn't hand it to Miller. He tossed it. The purse hit the muddy cobblestones at Miller's feet with a wet, heavy clinking sound. Miller stared at the purse, then looked up at Gideon, his face flushing dark red with insult. "You throw coin at me like a dog?" "Dogs have better manners," Gideon said softly. He stepped over the threshold, moving into the alley. He didn't rush. He walked with slow, measured steps, backing Miller up until the butcher hit the brick wall of the opposite building. Hazel pulled herself up, clutching her scraped arm. She watched, entirely mesmerized. This wasn't the behavior of a northern mill owner. Mill owners argued over ledgers. This man moved with the absolute, unquestioned authority of a lord, someone who owned the ground he stood on and the air the butcher breathed. Gideon stopped a foot away from Miller. He leaned in slightly. "Pick it up," Gideon commanded. Miller opened his mouth, his hand twitching toward the cleaver at his belt. Gideon shifted his weight. It was a minute adjustment, but the sheer, coiled violence radiating from his large frame was suddenly suffocating. "Touch that blade," Gideon whispered, "and I will break both of your arms. Pick it up." Miller broke. The defiance drained out of his face, leaving only pale, sweaty fear. He bent down, his knees popping in the quiet alley, and picked up the muddy purse. "Never return to this house," Gideon said. "If I see your face on this street again, I won't pay you. I will end you. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Miller mumbled to the mud. He turned and practically ran down the alley, his heavy boots splashing in the puddles. Gideon stood in the rain for a moment, watching the man disappear. Then he turned around. The cold, violent mask vanished. He looked at Hazel, standing shivering in the doorway, clutching her bleeding arm. His jaw tightened. He walked back to the door. He didn't ask if she was all right. He simply reached out, sliding one arm behind her back and the other under her knees. "What are you doing?" Hazel gasped as he lifted her effortlessly off the ground. She felt entirely weightless against his chest. "You're bleeding," he said, carrying her into the house and kicking the heavy door shut behind them with a slam that echoed through the dark hallway. "And you're shaking." "I am angry," Hazel argued, her voice trembling wildly. She pressed her good hand flat against his chest, trying to maintain some distance. His shirt was damp from the rain, the fabric clinging to the hard muscle beneath. The heat of him was overwhelming. "Put me down. I can walk." "No, you can't. Your shoe is full of blood from that blister you refuse to complain about." Gideon carried her straight into the kitchen, ignoring her protests. He set her down gently on the solid oak table, right in the center of the room. Hazel sat there, the coarse wool of her dress damp, her mob cap askew, hair falling in wet strands across her face. She felt incredibly small. Gideon grabbed a clean cloth from the drying rack and walked to the water pump. He wet the cloth, wrung it out, and walked back to her. He stepped between her knees. Hazel's breath caught in her throat. She tried to pull her legs back, but the edge of the table trapped her. He was standing flush against her, his broad chest level with her eyes. Gideon took her arm. His touch was incredibly gentle, a jarring contrast to the brutal man who had just threatened to break a butcher's arms. He dabbed the wet cloth against the scrape on her forearm, washing away the mud and blood. Hazel stared at his throat. She couldn't look at his face. The internal contradiction was tearing her apart. She was supposed to be cynical. She was supposed to hate him for buying her father's life for pennies. But right now, smelling the rain on his skin and feeling the startling gentleness of his calloused hands, she felt a terrifying, raw swell of emotion. "Why did you do that?" she whispered. Gideon stopped wiping her arm. He looked down at her. His slate eyes were dark, searching her face. "Because," he said, his gravelly voice dropping to a near whisper, "I protect what is mine." Hazel's heart slammed against her ribs. She looked up at him, her lips parted, the cynical retort dying entirely in her throat. She wasn't an investment. She wasn't a ship. But as Gideon Croft stared down at her in the quiet, dim kitchen, she realized with a jolt of sheer panic that he wasn't talking about the house. He was talking about her. The silence in the kitchen was heavier than the damp London air outside. "I am not one of your assets," Hazel said. The words were meant to be sharp, but they came out entirely devoid of edge. Her voice shook. "No," Gideon agreed. His hand dropped from her arm, his calloused fingers brushing against her wrist as he pulled away. "An asset can be liquidated. You are entirely indispensable." He didn't step back. He simply bent down. Hazel's breath hitched as his hands went to her left foot. He gripped her ankle with one hand, a firm, warm shackle, and used the other to untie the stiff leather shoe. He pulled it off. The friction against her raw heel sent a jolt of fire up her calf. She bit her lips so hard she tasted copper, refusing to make a sound. He unpeeled the bloody, crude linen bandage. He didn't grimace at the sight of the ruined flesh. He examined it with the same clinical, terrifying focus he used on her father's ledgers. "You will stop wearing these," Gideon stated. It wasn't a request. He stood up, taking the blood-stained shoe and its twin, and tossed them casually toward the cold hearth. "And you will stop wearing that dress. The masquerade is over. If I wear my own clothes, my father will know I'm working with you," Hazel said, pulling her bare foot up onto the edge of the oak table, suddenly hyper-aware of her exposed ankle. "He thinks I'm hiding in the scullery to avoid the shame of our ruin." "Your father," Gideon said, turning to the sink to wash the blood from his hands, is currently at his club in St. James, spending the first installment of my capital on cheap brandy and bad cards. He won't notice what you're wearing, and I am tired of watching you scratch your neck." He dried his hands on a towel. He didn't look at her. "Go upstairs. Wash the soot off your face. Put on something that doesn't smell of lye. We have the Baltic Manifest to review before midnight." Hazel stared at his broad back. She wanted to argue. She wanted to throw the wet cloth at his head and tell him he had no right to order her about in her own house. But the exhaustion sitting deep in her bones won. She slid off the table. Her bare foot hit the cold flagstones, and she limped out of the kitchen without a word. Her bedroom at the top of the stairs was freezing. Hazel stripped off the coarse wool dress. It pooled on the floor like a dead, heavy thing. She kicked it into the corner. She poured icy water from the pitcher into her basin and scrubbed her face and arms until the skin was pink and stinging. Then she opened her wardrobe. It was mostly empty. Her father had pawned her mother's good silks months ago. What remained were the practical, outdated gowns she had deemed too worn to sell. She pulled out a dark green day dress. The fabric was thin, the velvet trim at the cuffs rubbed entirely bald, but it was soft. It smelled faintly of dried lavender and stale dust, not grease and chemical soap. When she pulled it over her head, the smooth fabric sliding against her bruised shoulders felt like an absurd luxury. She took the pins out of her hair, tossing the hideous mob cap onto the bed. Her dark hair cascaded down her back, a tangled, heavy mess. She brushed it out roughly and braided it tight, a practical, severe style that kept it out of her face. She slipped her feet into her own soft leather slippers. They offered no support, but they didn't bite into her heel. When Hazel walked back down the stairs, she felt strange. Stripped of the maid's uniform, she no longer had a shield. She was just Hazel Linley, the daughter of a ruined man, walking willingly back into a room with the man who had bought them both. She paused outside the study door. The smell of rich tobacco smoke drifted through the crack. She pushed the door open. Gideon was sitting at the desk. He had lit the oil lamp, casting a warm, golden circle of light over the scattered papers. He looked up as she entered. He didn't offer a compliment. He didn't smile. His slate-gray eyes simply swept over her, taking in the frayed cuffs of the green dress, the severe braid, the absence of the white collar. The tight line of his jaw relaxed, just a fraction. "The Baltic records," he said, tapping a thick stack of vellum with his pen. "Page 4. Your father paid a docking fee in Copenhagen that doesn't match the tonnage. Find out why." Hazel walked to her small side desk. The chair no longer felt like a punishment. She sat down, pulled the inkwell closer, and opened the ledger. "He likely bribed the harbor master," Hazel said, her voice dropping back into its natural, educated cadence. "He prefers to avoid the customs inspections. They slow down the unloading." Gideon let out a low grunt of agreement. The scratching of his pen resumed. They worked in silence. The rain beat against the window panes. For the first time in months, Hazel didn't feel the suffocating grip of panic in her chest. She just smelled the ink, the tobacco, and the faint scent of dried lavender, and let the numbers anchor her to the desk. 2 weeks passed. They were brutal, exhausting weeks, governed entirely by the rhythm of Gideon Croft's relentless ambition. He dismantled Richard Linley's shipping company piece by rotting piece, cutting dead weight, firing lazy captains, and selling off the ruined hull impounded in Bristol. He was merciless. Hazel watched him ruin men's livelihoods with a single stroke of his pen. She should have been disgusted. She should have maintained her cynical detachment. Instead, she was fascinated. Gideon didn't operate with cruelty. He operated with precision. When he fired a man, he paid him a month's severance, more than her father had ever done. When he argued with the dock authorities over tariffs, he didn't shout. He just sat in the study, writing letters with a cold, terrifying authority that somehow bent the Port of London to his will, and he treated her as an equal. He never thanked her, but he stopped double-checking her math. When they disagreed on a route, Hazel favoring the safer, slower coastal passage to Lisbon, Gideon pushing for the faster, riskier open water crossing. They fought bitterly over the desk. He didn't patronize her. He yelled at her. She yelled back, and when she proved, using 3 years of weather logs, that the autumn squalls would cost them a week in repairs, he simply crossed out his own route and wrote hers in. It was an intoxicating, dangerous dynamic. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the illusion shattered. The rain had finally cleared, leaving the London streets steaming in the pale sunlight. Hazel was kneeling on the floor of the study, surrounded by the archives from 1822, hunting for a missing cargo manifest. Her fingers were stained black with ink. Gideon was standing by the window, smoking. He had rolled his sleeves up to his elbows, exposing the thick, scarred forearm she had grown entirely too used to looking at. The heavy, unmistakable rumble of an expensive carriage rolling to a stop echoed from the street front. Hazel frowned, looking up from the dusty files. Father isn't due back from his club for hours, and the butcher knows better than to return. Gideon didn't move. He kept his eyes on the street, taking a slow drag of his cheroot. It isn't the butcher. The brass knocker pounded against the front door. It wasn't the frantic hammering of a tradesman. It was the sharp, authoritative strike of a footman. Hazel scrambled to her feet, dusting off her skirts. I should answer it. We still have no staff. Leave it, Gideon said. His voice had gone entirely flat. But the pounding came again, louder. Hazel ignored him, hurrying out of the study and down the dim hallway. She pulled open the heavy oak door. A footman in immaculate blue and gold livery stood on the stoop. Behind him, a massive, lacquered carriage bearing a complicated aristocratic crest blocked the narrow street. Before the footman could speak, the carriage door opened. A man stepped out. He was dressed in the height of fashion. A pristine beaver hat, a coat tailored so sharply it looked like armor, and a silver-handled walking stick. He looked around the decaying street with a mixture of amusement and deep disgust. He walked past the footman, his eyes locking onto Hazel. He took in her faded dress and ink-stained hands with a dismissive glance. "Tell your master I'm here," the man drawled, his accent thick with the lazy arrogance of the upper nobility. "Lord Cavendish." "My father is not at home, my lord," Hazel said, keeping her voice even, though her stomach tightened. Cavendish laughed, a short, sharp sound. "I don't care about your father, girl. I'm here for the man hiding in his study." Hazel froze. "Mr. Croft?" Cavendish's eyebrows shot up. "Croft? Good God, is that what he's calling himself? How terribly dreary." Cavendish pushed past her, stepping into the hallway without invitation. He didn't wait for her to lead him. He walked straight toward the open door of the study. Hazel hurried after him, her pulse drumming a frantic warning in her ears. Cavendish paused in the doorway. Gideon was still standing by the window. He hadn't turned around. He casually crushed the end of his cheroot into the brass tray on the sill. "I must admit," Cavendish said, leaning heavily on his walking stick, "when the Prince Regent said you had vanished into the gutters of London to play at being a merchant, I thought he was joking. But the smell of this house, well, it certainly suits a masquerade." Gideon finally turned. The rough, grounded energy he had carried for the past 2 weeks was gone. He stood perfectly straight, his chin lifted. The sheer, crushing arrogance in his posture was sudden and terrifying. He didn't look like a mill owner. He looked like a king assessing a highly annoying insect. "You are trespassing, Arthur," Gideon said softly. Cavendish sighed. "The Crown requires your signature on the Naval Appropriations Bill. You cannot hide in a bankrupt merchant's house forever, Your Grace. The House of Lords is in a panic. Your estate manager is threatening to drown himself in the Serpentine. It is time to come home." Hazel stopped breathing. She stood in the hallway, her hand clutching the door frame. The words hit her physically, like a blow to the ribs. "Your Grace." She looked at Gideon, at his rough hands, at the jagged scar over his eye, at the brutal, uncompromising man who had sat at her desk and argued over the price of sugar. You have delivered your message, Gideon said, his slate eyes locked on Cavendish. He hadn't looked at Hazel. Now get out. Westmoreland, be reasonable. Get out. The command wasn't shouted. It was whispered with such lethal, absolute authority that Cavendish actually took a step back, the blood draining from his aristocratic face. Very well, Cavendish muttered, recovering his composure with visible effort. I shall tell the regent you are still suffering from whatever madness grips you. He turned on his heel and walked past Hazel, not looking at her again. The front door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent house. Hazel stood frozen. The smell of Cavendish's expensive cologne lingered in the air, clashing sickeningly with the scent of ink and old dust. She looked at the man by the window. The Duke of Westmoreland. He owned coal mines. He owned entire port cities. He didn't just have capital, he had a fortune so vast it was rumored to rival the crown's. And he had been sitting in her drafty study, drinking bitter coffee and letting her treat him like a northern brute. Gideon slowly turned his head. He finally looked at her. Hazel didn't wait for him to speak. She turned and walked away. She didn't run to her room to cry. Crying was a useless indulgence. She walked into the kitchen, picked up the heavy iron kettle, and set it on the stove with a slam that rattled the grates. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a white-hot, consuming rage. She had let her guard down. She had let herself admire him. She had sat across from him every night, sharing the crushing burden of her family's ruin, believing they were partners in the muck. And he had been playing a game, a wealthy, bored lord slumming it with the desperate for his own amusement. The kitchen door opened. Hazel didn't turn around. She grabbed the handle of the water pump and began violently working it up and down. Hazel! His voice sounded the same, gravelly, deep. It made her stomach twist with a sickening jolt of betrayal. Should I curtsy, Your Grace? She asked, her voice dripping with venom. She didn't stop pumping the water. Or should I put the lye-washed dress back on? Which masquerade did you prefer? The idiot scullery maid or the desperate clerk? Gideon walked up behind her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a physical weight pressing against her spine. Stop the water, he said. I need to wash the ink off my hands, she snapped. I wouldn't want to dirty the Duke's ledgers. Gideon reached out. He wrapped his large hand over hers on the iron pump handle, forcing it to a stop. The sudden silence in the kitchen was deafening. Let go of me, she breathed. I'm not playing a game, Gideon said. His voice was low, taut, with a strange, harsh desperation. I bought this debt because the routes are valuable. I came as Gideon Croft because when I walk into a room as the Duke of Westmoreland, men lie to me, they grovel, they hide their rotting ships and their forged ledgers behind a wall of sycophantic praise. I wanted the truth of the investment. So you lied to get it. Hazel yanked her hand out from under his, spinning around to face him. She didn't care that he was a duke. She didn't care that he could crush her father with a word. She was so angry she was vibrating. You sat there and watched me panic, she hissed, jabbing a finger against his solid chest. You watched me ruin my hands. You watched my father humiliate himself. And you had the wealth of a kingdom sitting in your pocket the entire time. You are worse than the butcher. He just wanted his money. You wanted our dignity. Gideon didn't flinch. He absorbed her anger, his slate eyes dark and unflinching. I didn't want your dignity, he said softly. I wanted your mind. Hazel faltered. Her hand dropped from his chest. I was going to leave the morning after I arrived, Gideon confessed, the words tearing out of him like jagged stones. The investment was a disaster. Your father is a fool. I had the contract drawn up to take the roots and leave him to rot. And then I saw you. He stepped closer. Hazel's back hit the edge of the stone sink. I saw a woman who wore a dress of coarse wool to save a man who didn't deserve her, Gideon said. He raised his hand, his knuckles brushing against the side of her face. His touch was rough, calloused, and utterly grounding. I saw a woman who stood in an alley and took a butcher's abuse rather than surrender. I saw the only person in this godforsaken city who looked at me and didn't see a title or a fortune. You saw a rough man, and you fought him. Hazel swallowed hard. The rage was melting, leaving behind that terrifying, exposed vulnerability she hated so much. You lied. I omitted a title that has brought me nothing but parasites, Gideon corrected quietly. He stepped flush against her. His hand moved to the back of her neck, his thumb resting over the pulse, jumping frantically at her throat. I need a partner, Hazel, not just for the shipping routes. I need someone who reads the margins, someone who doesn't simper. I need the woman who tracked the ghost sugar. Hazel stared up at him. She saw the scar over his eye, the exhaustion lining his face. He wasn't a fairy tale prince. He was a ruthless, demanding, difficult man. And she was a cynical, exhausted woman who had finally found someone strong enough to carry the weight with her. You are a terrifying man, Your Grace, she whispered. Then it is a good thing you're not easily frightened, Gideon replied. He didn't ask for permission. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, sweeping, romantic kiss. It was hard, grounded, and desperate. It tasted of bitter coffee, tobacco, and the undeniable truth that the masquerade was finally over. Hazel gripped the lapels of his coat, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the solid, unyielding reality of him. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing heavily in the dim, damp kitchen. Gideon rested his forehead against hers. He let out a long, ragged sigh that sounded entirely human. Now, the Duke of Westmoreland murmured, his gravelly voice brushing against her lips. We have the Baltic ledgers to finish, and your father owes me for 50 crates of ghost sugar. Hazel let out a wet, breathless laugh. She closed her eyes, her ink-stained hand still gripping his coat. 90%, Your Grace, she whispered back. Not a penny more. Did Hazel and Gideon's ruthless partnership leave you breathless? If you love this grounded, raw, historical romance, don't let the story end here. Like this video to show your support, and share it with fellow historical drama lovers who crave imperfect, fiercely competent protagonists and enemies to lovers, tension without the fluff. Every interaction helps bring more immersive, cynical yet emotional stories to life. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter. Tell me in the comments. What was your favorite sensory detail in the story? Let's discuss below.